Okay, so looking at the body paragraphs, think of the most logical approach to describe the data. Chronological, so is this by time, um, by gender, male or female, by country? In this case, I'm going to describe the chart by nationality. Find specific data to support the main pattern, trend, event described in the introduction. Okay, we'll come to that. So, what are the key figures relating to that main trend? Yeah. Highlight the data that must be included. So, in my previous slide, the green information, the other patterns, and what are some of the key figures relating to these patterns. Very important, don't try to describe every piece of data. It's virtually impossible in 150 words. Okay. Finally, we have the conclusion. This is very different from the conclusion in your 250 word essays. Conclusion should not be full-blown paragraph. Okay. It suffices to just write a sentence or two, and this sentence should just paraphrase the main point that you put forward in the introduction. So it's repeating the overview again. And just use some of the linkers that you know or already know. Nothing too long, nothing too fancy to introduce the conclusion. Here are some examples of the linkers that you could use. And here is an example of a conclusion. Okay. So to summarize, the diagram shows that the proportion of tourists visiting Corfu from these three nationalities was more equally distributed in 2005 compared to 2000 and 1995. Okay, keep it simple. Okay, so let's have a look at an example of a task 1 writing based on the chart that we've been studying in this lecture. Here we have the rephrase, the paraphrase of the chart description provided in the question. And the second sentence is a general statement showing the overall trend. Leave a space and then write your main body. And I've started with the Japanese. And I've given not too many figures. Try not to put in too many figures because it becomes difficult to understand and confusing. With each figure, I've put it, as you can see, next to a year. So it makes it clearer when I'm referring to the changes. Okay, can you see here and here? Really, I focus mainly on the Japanese and the Russians because they've shown the most significant changes. As you can see, the number of French tourists has increased modestly. Okay, so I've not dedicated too much of my word count going into detail there because it's you're just looking for what are the main points, what are the most important points in that graph, in that bar chart. Okay. And here you can see my summary is just one sentence. So it's about 160 words there. You'll be fine with that, but please don't write 200, 250 words, it's too much. Okay, you're being assessed on your ability to summarize information. Okay, let's have a look at some of the mistakes that people who have not been trained generally make when they undertake a task 1 writing. So this is quite common, as you can see here, it's 15%. And people, when they get stressed, they're not analysing the graph or the chart correctly, and they can put in the wrong figures. This is quite common as well. People just copy the description that they find in the question. These words, because they're copied, will just be taken off the total word count and you will not receive any marks. This is quite common as well. So people make assumptions based on the information. They bring their own opinions into the chart. Okay, this information about the economy. Okay, you might read about the Russian economy and there might have been something happening in 2005, but it's not shown here. Okay, in the chart, you can only report back the information that you see in the chart. So it should be reported back coldly. There shouldn't be any appraising language. Okay, no emotional language. This is quite common. As you can see here, it's just listed. In this example, the person's just going to list this figure, 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 this figure. So there is no real comparison made, and the key features are not selected and reported back. It's not a summary. Okay, so people generally, they put their opinions in the conclusion. They feel it's like a 250-word essay, and they're used to giving their opinions in this. In task 1 writing, you don't give your opinion. This happens quite often, and it's difficult for me to select the key features and what is the most significant data. Sometimes we find that people, they go overboard and they just bombard their writing with facts and figures, and even though they're correct, it becomes confusing to the reader, and so you lose marks on coherence and cohesion. This is also the other extreme. So sometimes people, they just give a very, very brief overview of what they see, and they don't include any figures. Okay, so it's quite vague. Okay, the final slide. This is very important. This is why I've saved this for last. Sometimes assumptions are made about the periods in between the years presented. So here we only have information for 1995, 2000 and 2005. There is a big question mark about 1993 before or 96 after, 2003. We don't know what happened. Okay, so sometimes students, they write from 1995 to 2005. Okay, it's not a line graph, it's a bar chart giving values in 3 particular years. And they might say there was continued growth in the percentage of Japanese tourists visiting Corfu. Well, we see growth here, and it's possible that there was continued growth. However, we don't know what happened in this part. In 1998, maybe there was a drop before there was an increase, so we cannot assume that the growth was continued. So be careful. Better when you have bar charts like this, not from and to, but in. So you say each year, in 1995, in 2000, in 2005. And the final point, numbers of tourists or numbers are confused with percentages, and this is why it's very important to study the X and Y axis. Okay, here we've got percentage. It's not the same as the number of tourists. So somebody might write the number of Russian tourists in 2000 and 2005 declined in comparison to the numbers in 1995. Okay, so the student here has used in, yeah, it's not said from and to, has used in. However, they're describing the number of Russian tourists. And even though this graph, this bar chart, sorry, shows a decline and then a little recovery, it does not show, potentially doesn't show a decline in the number of Russian tourists. It only shows a decline in the proportion of Russian tourists as a percentage of the total number of tourists who visited Corfu. So, although this has declined, maybe the number of tourists from Russia actually increased by, say, 1,000. You know, it might have increased by 1,000 here, and it might have increased by 1,000 here. However, we can only say proportion because maybe the number of French tourists increased by 10,000, or maybe the number of Japanese tourists increased by 50,000. And so their relative increase in proportion compared to the Russian tourists, okay, has affected these figures. It's difficult to understand, but we cannot use numbers, the number of tourists. We can only say the percentage or the proportion. Okay, so be careful here. If you have tourist numbers in Corfu, go ahead, you can say the numbers, that's fine. But if you see percentage here, you need to reflect that in your language here. Okay? And that's it. If you have any questions, give me a shout, drop me a message on Teams, and I'll be happy to try and answer. Okay, I know it's a lot of information to process, but I hope it's helped.